There is a woman in a forest. She comes to a decaying building and discovers a dark door. She reaches for the handle, turns it. The door creaks open. She stares into the black and sees nothing. Frustrated, she digs in her pockets, pulls out a lighter, flicks it on. The tiny yellow flame quivers in the air. She takes a step over the threshold. Hello? And then another step into the dark. Now, we all know how this horror movie is going to end. Badly. Logic, smart decision-making, critical thinking. These are the enemies of the horror movie. But I want to talk to you today about how the woman at the door can be all of us. Now, the dark door is something that we all need to open, because there is something down there, something that we cannot bear to face. And that is exactly why we need to face it. Now, we don't all have the same dark door. They can take many forms: trapdoor, cave, an ocean. None of these dark doors have been captured on film and brought to the collective imaginations yet. But when they are, what use are they? That's the question I want to try and answer. A question that has bothered me for years. What use is horror? What use is horror? Sure, horror films can be entertaining. Something akin to a roller coaster, a cheap thrill, right? But beyond that, can they serve a purpose? Now, don't get me wrong, any art form, high or low, can or should be considered an end in itself. But I believe that horror can actually be tremendously useful, especially in the moment that we find ourselves today, where monstrous things seem to creep around every corner. So we'll start by talking about the thing that drives all horror movies: fear. Now here I'm indebted to the novelist and previous TED talker, Karen Thompson Walker. Her TED Global talk from 2012 is called What Fear Can Teach Us, and it's great. What Thompson Walker has to say in a nutshell is this: what if we think of our fears as a kind of unintentional storytelling that we do to ourselves? You know, we open the dark door, we look down the dark hall, and already our minds are racing ahead, asking the question of what's there, and then supplying us with a variety of terrifying answers. She says, most of us don't have a problem imagining these scenarios. Now, we don't struggle to write these horror stories for ourselves, but often we struggle to read these stories in a way that's actually useful to the choices that we make. So what Thompson Walker says to us is that we can read those fears. Now, here, it is useful to think about the distinction between two basic kinds of fear, between terror and horror. Devendra Varma provides a useful distinction between terror and horror. He says, terror and horror, the difference between terror and horror is the difference between awful apprehension and sickening realization. The difference between the smell of death and stumbling against the corpse. So terror is the dreaded expectation of something awful, whereas horror is the actual experience of coming face to face with the object of that dread. You see, scary stories stick, even if we can believe and discover with a little research that these stories may be untrue. For example, when I ask my students what they're more afraid of, sharks or bees, the majority of them will say sharks. Okay, sharks. And I think, I think movies like Jaws have something to do with this. And I'm sure Alfred Hitchcock would agree that when you remove a person's clothes and add water, this innate sense of human vulnerability increases the dread factor tremendously. But you see, in the United States last year, 1 person was killed by a shark, and 56 people died from being stung by a hornet or wasp or a bee. Yet overwhelmingly, people fear the shark. They dread the shark. And this is possibly because these stories are reinforced for us by culture. Movies like Jaws, things like Shark Week. The scary stories that we tell ourselves and that culture reinforce for us, they stick. So here's another horror movie that's all about dread. Okay? Interior, bedroom, night. A 17-year-old boy awakes to discover that in place of the normal bedroom door that has always been there, there is a dark door. The door seems to look at him, seems to grumble as if something inside is moving in the cavernous blackness. The boy pulls the sheet up above his eyes in an attempt to shut out the nightmare. Interior, biology classroom, daytime. The boy has dark rings under his eyes. He yawns and shakes his head in an attempt to stay focused on the lecture. Then he hears a sound like a dead tree bending in the wind. He looks up and sees the dark door. He slams his book closed and darts from the room. Fellow students stare in amazement as he flees. Now he strides down a corridor lined with lockers, head down, trying to talk himself out of the dreaded hallucination. He comes to the end of the corridor, reaches out his hand, places it on the exit, and looks up to discover it is not the exit, but the dark door he has his hand upon. He drops his books and runs. Later, the boy's in a park with some friends. They pass around a bottle that one of them snuck from a parent's liquor cabinet. He takes a long gulp of the burning liquid. He steadies himself and looks around. Nothing. No door, just the park and his friends. He takes another swig. Later, it's dark. The boy is at some kind of party in the woods. There are large oil drums burning to light the clearing. Violent electronic music is thumping from the speaker stacks. Boom, boom, boom. He is hammered now. He's swaying. Strobe lights are flashing. He staggers through the crowds of young people. He sees flashes of faces contorted in fearsome masks. Boom, boom, boom. He walks past the crowd, past some trees, and there he sees the door. The music seems to fade, and now that boom, boom, boom is coming from the other side of that door, as if something terrible were trying to smash its way out. The door grows in the flickering light. Its hinges groan. Now, the terrifying thing about this story is that it is true. The 17-year-old boy is me. I'll explain. In 1997, my parents, John James and Camilla Carr, they traveled to Grozny in Chechnya to run a center for children who've been orphaned by the Russian invasion. They worked there for a couple of months, and then they were kidnapped. They were tortured, and my stepmother was raped numerous times as they were held hostage in a variety of bedrooms, cellars, barns, even a sauna. After 14 months, they were released and returned to the UK. Now, as these events unfolded, details were sparse. Occasionally, we would get a letter demanding ransom. Once in the night, we received a phone call saying, it was my dad saying, if we didn't get them the money soon, it would be too late. What was happening to my parents in captivity was invisible to me. And that invisibility conspired with my imagination. This scary story stuck. And so I did everything in my power to shut down that storytelling part of myself, my imagination. What is my greatest asset, my greatest source of joy and creativity? My imagination. I shut it down. I started with alcohol. I smoked a little pot. Then I smoked a lot. Then I turned to harder things to try and keep that door shut. I shut that door and I ran from it. But I wasn't a total burnout. I was very lucky to get into university. I tried to study theatre, but what was most visceral, most accessible to me was film. I've learned a great deal from film. It's a medium of light that comes alive in the darkness. And I've especially learned some things from horror. So here are a few discoveries that I've made that I want to share with you. Number one, remember the woman in the opening scene in the forest? She is everywhere in horror. She is one of my favorite characters, Ellen Ripley from the movie Alien. This is a character who spends the whole film saying, guys, this is a bad idea. And she is overruled by the men in that film time and time again until they're all dead. She is Barbara in Night of the Living Dead. Johnny, stop it, she pleads, but he doesn't. My stepmother said no to the men that raped her. But she went unheard because they thought they knew or they needed to about this situation. And who cares what she has to say anyway? The horror film teaches us then what happens when we ignore women, when we deprive them of a voice. Horror shows us that we must listen to women when they say they feel unsafe, when they sense danger, when they say no. Useful discovery one, listen to women. Sounds simple, but two, by contrast, and you'll bear with me on this one, horror monsters are people too. From Frankenstein to movies like Silence of the Lambs, horror is populated by characters who are maligned by society, ignored and disregarded to the degree that they have no choice but to react through violence. This is an important lesson. When my parents came back from captivity, I could not understand how they could have empathy for these men who had abused them so terribly. What I learned was that these men had been made monstrous. The Russian invasion had deprived them of their livelihood, of their community. They'd lost their friends. Their family members had died, their mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, their wives, their children. These men had nothing but the hatred in their hearts and the stories that they'd been told how the West turned a blind eye when they needed our help. So horror shows us that when we look past the face of terror, behind the mask, we can actually see something far more unsettling in our own community that is worthy of our scrutiny. Three, finally, and perhaps the greatest way that horror can be useful now and into the future, brings me back to movies like Jaws and hinges upon the way that it is constructed to manipulate us and terrorize us. You see, in 1974, Steven Spielberg was experiencing his own kind of dread. As he watched the first lunges of his $250,000 shark in action, his heart sank. The beast was anything but menacing. Its eyes crossed, the paint kept coming off in the salt water, its jaws didn't even close properly, and it had a big dimple in its chin that made it look like Kirk Douglas. But even if the shark had functioned properly and perfectly, it would never have been as effective as what Spielberg decided to do. The shark was almost totally cut from the film, and that is what made it terrifying. Its invisibility. So, discovery number 3, invisibility is what gives horror monsters their power. Obfuscation, maskedness. Therein lies their power to terrorize us and pick us off one by one. The novelist H.P. Lovecraft knew exactly what he was doing when he said that his monsters were unspeakable or unimaginable, because through the open void of those words, he offered us a dark space to imagine our own personalized fears into. And that's what horror does. It offers us that dark space. And we can read our own horrors into it. But then, as Karen Thompson Walker says, we can study those fears. A film that does this brilliantly, a recent film that does this brilliantly, is Jordan Peele's Get Out. This is a movie that takes something that's virtually invisible to a huge proportion of the population, the lie of living in a post-racial society, and it gives it back to us in equal parts funny and shocking and horrifyingly recognizable. So this is how horror can not only be entertaining, but can be profoundly useful in the future. And finally, I just want to address the dark door one last time. And I want to talk about something that some of you may find uncomfortable, but that is what horror is meant to do. A Chapman University survey from 2016 reported that 41% of Americans were either afraid or very afraid of terrorist attack. But maybe this is just like the sharks and the bees. You see, if we look at the numbers from the US Department for Disease Control and Prevention, we can see that the total number of deaths caused by terrorism between 2001 and 2013 are 3,380. And yet, the total number of deaths caused by firearms during that same period is 406,496. That second number is over 120 times greater. Now that's a scary story. And here's another one. Since 1979, the US has lost 116,385 children and teens to guns. Now that number is 3 times greater than the number of US military deaths during the Vietnam War. That number is 23 times greater than the number of US military deaths during Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I moved to this country from the UK, and so perhaps that explains why I'm unable to understand why this is allowed to happen in this democracy and no other. Is there a good reason, or do we keep the deaths of those children behind a dark door that we do not dare to open? I can understand why we cannot bear to open it. I've stood in front of the dark door myself. I've been too afraid, because to open it meant to face things that were too powerful for me to deal with on my own. But we do not have to face these things alone. If I've learned anything from horror movies, it's don't split up. So together, we can open these dark doors. We can drag these horror monsters out into the light beyond the movie theater and give them the scrutiny, the compassion, the understanding, and the action that they need. So let's open the door.